and say to land at Lionel Road South.
Thank you, Chair. We have two applications which relate to the Brentford FC Lionel Road Stadium development. Members would be aware that planning permission has already been granted for the club to move to a new ground from the existing ground at Griffin Park. The scheme would be funded by enabling housing development on land surrounding the new stadium. The site has been allocated in our new local plan for a stadium with enabling housing development. There's the site, I'm sure you've probably seen it before. There is the site allocation. Now, since the permission was granted in 2014, there have been a number of minor amendments to the scheme. We've also approved reserved matters for 640 of the original 910 dwellings. And the council also made a compulsory purchase order to help deliver the scheme, which was found to have major economic, environmental and social benefits. And I also note that the scheme has been implemented as of March of this year. On a procedural point, we're not revisiting the principle of the original development. That has permission, it's been implemented. What the first application is considering is amendments to a number of the conditions of that permission. And the intent there is to replace some of the approved drawings with some replacement drawings that make some minor changes to the stadium, changes to the surrounding public realm, and then also changes to the original design code and parameters which were going to guide and control the housing blocks that were going to fund the stadium. The original conditions and the legal obligations that were agreed with that permission would all stay. Where they are relevant and where details have already been approved, they can be incorporated within this permission, but importantly the obligations on the landowners to provide funding for various community infrastructure, some of the community work, and also affordable housing would all be retained. If I move on, we're talking about changes to the stadium in the middle of the site. That part of the scheme had detailed planning permission, and then we're also going to talk about some changes to one of the blocks, which is called the Central Eastern Block, and then this site here is called the Central Southern Block. Each of those housing blocks already has a reserved matters approval. What this scheme is looking to do is to make some minor changes to that now that Brentford has a development partner on board, and this scheme reflects some of the improvements that company is bringing to the development. So that's an aerial image of the approved scheme with the approved reserved matters for these blocks here, and then this is an image of the proposed scheme. So it is very similar. I'll go through some of the changes in a bit more detail in a moment. We've consulted over 900 properties in the surrounding locality. We had received 14 submissions from some individuals and amenity groups. There were 9 responses in support. There were 3 objections, and there's a couple of mixed or neutral responses. Importantly, both the Mayor of London and TfL were consulted, and they responded that this application raises no strategic issues, and they were content with the mitigation that's already been agreed via the original conditions and the existing legal agreement, and that includes for the affordable housing element. So going on to the minor amendments, the proposal seeks to make some changes to the stadium to bring it in line with Premier League football requirements. The capacity would be reduced from 20,000 down to 17,250. Some of the stands would be reduced in size, and their construction and their design would be simplified. That's partly to reflect the changes that the club feels would be sustainable for its business model, so they're looking to also increase the number of hospitality seats, but there'd still be more than enough general admission seats. I think there's about 14,000 of those, and at present there's about 6,000 season ticket holders. In respect of the overall footprint of the stadium, it would be moved further away from railway lines to the north, and that allows a new road to be put in around the northern side of the stadium. That assists with the stadium's construction, but it also creates a new area of public realm, and so people can move around the entire perimeter of the stadium. In green there is the height of one of the stands, the east and west stands, as approved, and as you can see that one's being lowered down. Overall the scale of the stadium is slightly smaller. We've got images of the approved stadium at the top, and then the proposed one at the bottom. It does still retain the distinctive sort of folded, bold design. It's very consistent with what was approved. The second part of the application, and then there's reserved matters that follow with this, are changes to the approved housing blocks. As approved, the two blocks to the south of the stadium were joined by a podium at ground floor level. What it meant was everyone who was going to the stadium from Kew Bridge would come underneath this block here in a walkway, or they'd walk along the road here, because the podium in the centre would block it. Now what's proposed is there's a new plaza between the two buildings, which would greatly improve the pedestrian access, the visibility, and activity along the approach to the stadium. And this is actually more in line with the original design code, and also our urban design officer's comments at the time that the approach should be open and as visible as possible. That's an image of the illustrative scheme which was shown at the planning committee when the application was decided, and interestingly it had the similar plaza. There's just some other views of the public realm. Other benefits of these changes are that at the ground floor there's going to be more commercial space, and so that area will be more active on non-match days, so you'll have perhaps a cafe or retail, that sort of use. A further advantage of this change is that the stadium itself becomes more of a distinctive place, so you can see it. It's not cut off by that podium, and it gives it a real identity. These are the two blocks at the northeastern side of the site. That's what was approved with the reserve matters, and this is the approach from the new bridge over some railway lines. The stadium to the left. As proposed, architecturally, we think there's improvements with new brickwork being used rather than cladding. The shape of the buildings is going to change, both on the central eastern site and the southern site. However, importantly, there's no more floor space, and the buildings are no higher than what's approved. The other most significant change is that the community uses which were contained within the stadium are now being moved to a central location at the base of one of the buildings. Again, what's important is that it doesn't diminish the community uses. The new community area is going to have a greater floor area than was approved. It's also easier to get to being in the one spot. Some of the other community spaces, so there was a learning zone and the interim education centre, and also the offices for the Brentford Community Sports Trust. They were distributed in various parts of the approved stadium. Some of those were reached underneath the stands and things like that, and they weren't also available on match days because they were shared with the general media. By putting in this location, they'll be accessible on match days, and they've got their own independent access, but they've also got the opportunity for their own branding and some outdoor activity in the new public realm that's adjacent to it. So overall, we think it's actually a much better location, and it functions a lot better. Again, that's the new community uses at the base of that building. The overall site plan and master plan is very similar to what was approved, but there's some key improvements that are resulting from the changes. One is the new route along the north, and bringing the stadium away from the railway. As I said, it means it's easier to build, but also makes that whole area around the stadium accessible. There's a really key benefit in getting a new route through here with active users along the ground floor, and then the community users being provided in a dedicated area enhances that as well. I'm just showing you the floor plans of the new Learning Zone and Interim Education Centre. As I noted, that the overall floor space for each of those uses is actually greater than what was approved. So it is better, and there's also better daylight, better access. There's lift access to each floor. Community Sports Trust offices. This drawing just shows that there's more activity around the base of these buildings, and the result of that is that when the stadium's not operating, because it's obviously only operating on weekends or the occasional weeknights, there will be activity around the stadium rather than having it as just a dead space. In respect of affordable housing, the original scheme didn't have any affordable housing up front, and that was purely based on the viability of the development, in that the housing was especially proposed to provide the funding for the stadium. That isn't changing with this scheme. There is an obligation on the Planning Commission which says that at a point about 3/4 of the way through the build, when all of the stadium is built, most of the housing is built, we'll know the exact cost of the stadium, the exact cost of the housing, and we'll also know the value of the housing, so what the sales values of that was. If there is any surplus there, then that money would be then used by the council or the developer to provide affordable housing, and that importantly that remains the case. Also to note is that this scheme releases the Griffin Park site, where there's another planning permission for 75 homes, and they're mostly 3, 4, and there's some 5-bedroom homes on that site. So with this site, the main line of road site is predominantly 1 and 2-bedroom units for rent, but it has to be seen in the context of this other application as well, where there's predominantly family homes with gardens and parking. Overall, we're content that the changes are minor material changes, so they fall within the Section 73 process. The changes to the stadium help make it more deliverable, makes it function better. The changes to the housing blocks make the overall scheme better. There's no additional harm on the townscape, and it's the quality of the accommodation is acceptable. So subject to the original conditions, the approved details that we've already signed off, and all the original planning obligations, we're recommending that these changes be approved.
Right, so we'll open it up for questions. Just one from me first, and it's not on detail on the scheme. I mean, I've seen the presentation. I've spent hours talking to you guys about it ever since. Could you explain in words of one syllable what the 2 votes that we have to take tonight are, just so everybody around this table is absolutely clear, Jane?
Yes. Sorry. So there's two applications being considered. The first one is for changes to conditions to the original permission. One of the conditions that is being changed is the drawing numbers, and that will change the detail of the stadium, and it will change the parameters for the housing blocks. There's another condition being changed, which changes the amount of floor space in the stadium, because the community uses are being moved out of the stadium, and it's also being reduced in size. And then the third condition that's being changed is, which I hadn't mentioned, is the addition of rugby use, but that was also considered earlier this year, and it was approved. Yeah. That's the first application. That's to change effectively the conditions of the permission and some of the parameters. The second application is to approve the details of the 2 housing blocks that we're looking at. There's 2 housing sites, and that's the detailed floor plans and elevations of those buildings. So we'd be looking at the unit sizes, the amenity space, and the materials. All of that is being approved with these reserve matters that are being submitted. So there's 2 votes.
Okay, that's nice, clear. Mel.
I think you may well have answered the second of my 2 points, and the first one is really only a. Sorry, I think you probably answered the second one of my points, and the first one was really a matter of clarification. I was going to ask, does this affect the planning permission that we've already granted for the London Irish venture? And my first point really was, how is this going to affect the original planning permission we gave for the Griffin Park site, which must be coming close to resubmission?
In respect of the London Irish proposal, that is effectively going to be incorporated into this permission, so they've reapplied for that to vary that condition, because the original consent had a condition which said that you can't play rugby here. Back in, I think it was February this year, that was amended to say you can play rugby.
So that still stands.
That's within this application tonight.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Chair, for that.
With the Griffin Park scheme, they received outline planning permission for that originally. It was renewed a number of times, and then of late reserve matters were put in, which covered all the detail of that application. They've been approved. I think there's it's going to run out sometime next year, so they'll have to maybe start doing something on that site by the middle of next year, I think it is. Obviously, with this, if this site,
fun.
yeah. There's discussions as to how because this scheme is being held up by the compulsory purchase order. There are some discussions about how that can be managed, that timing issue.
John.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
John.
Thanks very much. Shane, can you look at paragraph 510? There's mention, amongst other things, of the stadium delivery being delayed. Can you try and put that in context? I'm concerned about the delay. Are you? Last 10.
Yeah. I think that's relating to the club would look to, on match days, secure up to 1,000 off-street parking spaces at some of the other.
About the delay in construction more than the parking.
Okay, well, sorry, that comment there is in relation to the fact that the delivery of this stadium has been delayed by the compulsory purchase order process, which has added about 18 months to the project. And that, in turn, has delayed finalising some of the negotiations about securing this off-site car parking.
Can I develop that briefly here? You've mentioned affordable housing, but there's no affordable housing. And viability, can you bring us up to date? The pre-planning presentation we had was very helpful, because really the motivation for many of these changes was television rights, lighting went with that, and some minor sensible construction. If I understand what you're saying about the affordable, you implied, which disappointed me, that any affordable, when that equation kicks in, would be off-site and not on-site. Is that correct?
Sorry, I should clarify. After the stadium, the central eastern, this site's called the Capitol Court site, and the central southern site, as well as the Griffin Park site. Once they're all completed, the viability is retested, and at that stage, if there is a surplus, a sufficient surplus, the developer has to then incorporate affordable housing on the Duffy side.
Okay. Thank you.
Guy, I had seen you.
This is an affordable housing question. The main purpose of this change to the scheme is to take cost out of it. I think that's acknowledged by the powers that be at Brentford. I believe it's 12 million that's taking out of the cost, I've heard. So that should assist with affordable housing. And I recognise that we do not have, because this has been treated as an amendment, we don't have a new viability assessment. So I just want to test two things actually. First is that the viability assessment, which we were told at the pre-planning thing will be reviewed in the same way as it would have been had the original scheme gone ahead. Therefore, there's no need for a viability assessment because it will happen 2/3 of the way through the build. So that's one point. The other point is, when we approved London Irish, that clearly, the arrival of London Irish clearly improved the viability of the scheme. And we were told at the time that that could not be taken into account in the assessment of viability and for social housing, for affordable housing. So I would like the revised viability assessment that happens 2/3 of the way through, please, to include the impact of the whatever rent or whatever income the club gets from the London Irish arrangements.
Well, in respect of the London Irish involvement in the scheme, I mean, the way viability methodology, which is guided now, there's a London Plan viability supplementary planning guidance document which sets out the methodology. It looks at the development costs and effectively the development revenue, but what it doesn't do is then take into account ongoing other costs. Now, in this particular site, it is a bit of a bespoke viability arrangement because the land costs were not put into the scheme, so the owner is just effectively putting the money in for those. So there is effectively the stadium has been taken out of some of the calculations which might normally be applied. It's the deal is that Brentford will provide the land of all these sites, and then the development partner will then provide the funding for new housing blocks and for the stadium, and then they'll try and recoup their money from selling the residential blocks and making a surplus. But as the agreement is, things like revenue from the club's corporate activity or rental in that respect, or television money, that's not part of this application. And you know, the football club itself doesn't make money, so we wouldn't be taking into account their deficit.
Well, sorry, does the assessment of viability, for example, if it was an office block, not take into account the rent that you get for the office block? Well, essentially this is rent.
Yeah, but you would in this case, a lot of the residential units are for rent, and those rental values are capitalised. I'm not an expert on that, but using their yield, it is turned into a value. But as I said, in this particular arrangement, the activities of the football club are outside of that deal. I mean, it's being considered as an important community asset. I know in the local plan, the purpose of the housing is to enable the stadium. That's very unusual. So it is a specific bespoke viability arrangement for this scheme. But we're not taking into account the revenue of the football club. And as I said, if that was the case, the club doesn't presently make money, so you wouldn't actually get anything out of that anyway.
Okay, so if I'm right that this is taking £12 million out of the cost of the scheme in the stadium end, which is what I'm informed, then what was a marginally viable thing for the collective of the football club and its development partner has now become a £12 million positive, in addition to whatever rent they're getting for London Irish. I mean, I think the point is we threw away all our planning policies in approving this in the first place. because of the lack of viability, because it's expensive to build a stadium. Now we're building a cheaper stadium and we're staying with the throwing away our planning policies, is my concern.
There's a few things there. In respect of the savings, part of the reason the stadium is being changed is to make it fit the purpose for that higher level, so the media facilities and so on. Those inherently actually add costs to the scheme. There's also been construction cost inflation since the scheme was envisaged back in 2012. So part of the reduction is actually offsetting increases that have occurred since the stadium was first designed. In respect of the actual viability and planning policies and so on, the arrangements that were considered by the committee were approved obviously by the committee. The viability was assessed independently, and I would say very rigorously by our independent consultant. The arrangement went to the Mayor of London, who agreed that arrangement.
Could people turn their phones off, please?
The application was also called into the Secretary of State, and he chose not to intervene at the time. We've just had the CPO public inquiry where viability was at the heart of that, and at the heart of some of the objections to the scheme. And the inspector at the time, who wrote an independent report for another Secretary of State, found that the viability arrangements were in fact justified, and all of the sites were needed to fund the stadium, and there was still a deficit. The Secretary of State agreed with all those conclusions, and then just recently this application has gone to the Mayor again, who obviously is very keen to encourage affordable housing, and I think again they've found no strategic issues with it. So it is unusual to have a scheme with no affordable housing, but in this particular case it is justified at this stage. Obviously with the review mechanism, we do hope that if things have improved, it will be captured in the future.
Colleague.
Thanks, Chair. You explained just now the detail of changes that are taking place on amendment, but I can't see any clarification on material itself. There is any amendment or changes. Can you please clarify whether is there any changes in the material or not? That would be helpful.
Well, in respect of the stadium itself, the materials are more or less the same. There's a little bit of extra sort of transparent sections to the upper floors, and that's to maximise daylight into the stadium. The main material changes are to the housing blocks. So this is an image of what was approved, and what was approved was a mixture of cladding and concrete. And the change that we're having now is that by moving the buildings away from the railway, it means that you can build in brick. Because previously they were so close to the railway lines, it was too hard to construct in brick. The brick material is actually more in keeping with some of the more traditional buildings that you find in the nearby area, and so we think this is actually an improvement. So that's the main change.
Tony, and then Mel.
Thank you, Bob. Forgive me, I was not on the committee that approved this originally, so some of the questions may appear dark to some people. Even questions that I've asked since I've joined the committee. Tell me a little bit about the. I mean, I totally agree with Councillor Lambert. They've reduced the costs, and they've reduced the costs. They've reduced some amenity, but this is not being the viability is not being revisited for the affordable housing, and that's what surprised me with this and a couple of other developments that were approved when I wasn't on the committee last. Can you tell us about the transport here, about Kew Bridge Station? Where does that fit in with this? And when are we going to see improvements there? Particularly the platform levels of platform, the inadequate access even now without a stadium going in and out of Kew Bridge Station. And you said that you said that there would be no more floor space, but will there be any further flats? Will there be any, you talked about 910 flats as part of the scheme, but will there be any extra flats or than first anticipated in these blocks? And I know down in Wandsworth they give permission for 3-bedroom flats and 2-bedroom flats, and lately down at Battersea they've been reducing them to 1-bedroom flats. But that's that's Wandsworth Council for you. But how does that fit in here? And are we going to get more flats out of the out of this than we'd already anticipated? But private flats rather than any social flats.
Well, in respect of Kew Bridge Station, the main improvement will be there will be disabled access to the London-bound platform by opening up the underpass. There's also a contribution of £250,000 to the station for improvements. There isn't any work proposed by Network Rail to change the level of the platform at the moment.
At what point, Shane?
Well, the money. If the scheme, when I think it's prior to the stadium commencing, I think they have to make the payment because there's a Network Rail agreement because they're also building a new bridge over the other railway line. So that payment will go to Network Rail to utilise.
So just to clarify.
Yeah.
By approving this, these reserve matters now, do we get the improvements to the Kew Bridge Station now, or do we have to wait for the stadium to be finished? Do we have to wait for blocks to be completed?
The stadium, the way the legal agreement works is that the stadium has to be delivered before housing can be completed, and before the stadium can be used, they have to build this access to Kew Bridge Station. So that
And the other improvements?
Well, the other improvements is a financial, it's a contribution, so that would have to go into Network Rail to see how they would spend it, but it has to be spent on the station in some way.
When's that available?
I think it's on completion of the Network Rail agreement, which I think is still being tweaked, but that would happen as the stadium starts being built, I suppose. Yeah.
Mel.
Thank you, Chair. When this came to planning, at that particular time I wasn't able to sit on the planning committee because of other reasons. However, this scheme was approved, or the original scheme. First of all, I'm absolutely flabbergasted that we're actually looking at amended scheme this evening, and we're not actually looking at a new planning application, because the plans before us are significantly different. You will argue in technical terms that that's not correct, but to a layperson and to the people sitting in the audience, these are completely different plans. I want to go back to the points that Councillor Lambert raised and Councillor Todd raised about the viability procedure, because by not having a new planning application, it has actually robbed us of the opportunity of going through the viability tests again. And so what we've got here are two planning applications with sweet Fanny Adams in terms of affordable housing at all. I hear what you say about this has been to the Mayor. However, this went to the Mayor under the original scheme, not the Mayor's strategy for housing has changed drastically since. That's not been taken into account, and also I deliberately asked the question of Griffin Park because when this was first envisaged, the actual sale of Griffin Park was actually dependent on the whole of the new stadium scheme going ahead. Which is why I've become increasingly concerned of the time lapse of the decisions that have been granted, as opposed to the time lapse that will run out on what's going to happen at Griffin Park. So we could end up in quite a difficult position. it's not for this planning meeting, but the Football League has actually granted Brentford special dispensation not to put seats in one end of the ground, simply on the basis that this stadium is going to be built hopefully by the middle of 2019, I beg your pardon, and at best at the end of it. But so.
Well, if it's not for this planning committee,
But
Mel,
some-
please
but
don't
it-
tell us about it.
But
We've
it
got
actually,
enough on the agenda
Chair,
without.
Chair, but it actually is, because it is now dependent on the other planning permission running out. And so therefore, I think that our planners have actually solved us a problem here, because we're getting no affordable housing. We've got a stadium which is reduced in size, and we're looking at it as an amended plan. And we've got absolutely nothing against the Mayor's housing test at all in terms of affordable. And I did want to make that point.
Could I actually ask there, Shane? I mean, what discussions have there been with the GLA, the Mayor's office, with regard to this amended scheme? Because I think that gets to the root of what we've got to look at this evening.
Well, the GLA, so the Mayor of London was formally consulted about this amended scheme, including the housing arrangements. They made inquiries to us, and they did query the housing mix and the affordable housing provision, and then wanted to make sure that the original obligations applied. I believe they did contact officers in our affordable housing team, who made queries to myself. We've also corresponded with the GLA, and as I said, their conclusion was it doesn't raise any more strategic issues, and they chose not to comment further, subject to the original planning obligations being applied to this amended application. So they had no issues with it, effectively.
I don't wish to come back.
Yeah. Was anyone going to move something?
Well, actually, what I'd like to do is, I actually would like to move this application. But in doing so, I want to say that as somebody who was on the original committee, that actually sat through several hours, I think it was past midnight, I think it may have even been nearly 1 o'clock in the morning that we actually finally made the decision. It was on balance, and I keep saying this to people. I wish, we keep going back to it, and we shouldn't even be discussing it, because that's what we know exactly what happened. This is an amended scheme. It's nice to see the plaza back. I have to say, I'm pleasantly pleased to see that one back, because as somebody who does go to football, not necessarily always to Brentford, I have been occasionally, but somebody who does go, it's incredibly important that you have open vistas so you can see where you're going and what's going on. It's also very good for public safety, so I think that's a great improvement. And as far as we've already been promised that there's going to be viability looked at 2/3 of the way through, when they're a little bit more clear about exactly what the costs are, and I think that is something that we obviously would be in favour of. So as I said before, I think this is definitely as an amended scheme, it's certainly better. I'm sad to see that they've had to reduce the capacity, but that's always on balance again. However, I think we just have to accept the fact that once we had approved this, and once everything hits together, it is, if you like, it's a kaleidoscope, and it's much better than original. So I would, as I say, I would like to move approval.
And that's on both the changes to the conditions and the details on the housing. Yeah. Is that seconded? Or can I see if it's seconded first?
Yeah.
Oh, you seconded. Oh.
Yeah, I just want to go back. I think it's totally important. I don't think we want no more delay on this, quite frankly. We need to extend the huge risk that this club has taken, and the owner. I was at the first hearing with you, and the council, rightly in its view, it was your administration, Mel, said we want a better stadium, we want a whole concept, and so we took away the obligation for affordable housing. It was a policy decision. I think the saving to the owner was 70, 80 million. It was a large sum, but that was considered appropriate to go from a small stadium in Brentford to a state-of-the-art one which has got huge commercial benefits. And I don't agree with it's an amendment. I think it's a very, very carefully thought out amendment, making the scheme we heard at the pre-app more viable, therefore the club will be more viable, and we wish the club every success post this application.
Any further comments?
I'm not arguing with that.
If not, right, what can I see? We're taking first of all vote on the changes to the conditions. Can I see those in favour? Anyone against? Any abstentions? And well, that's quite clearly carried. And secondly, voting on the details on the two housing blocks. Can I see those in favour? Those against? Abstentions? Again carried. Right, thank you. Right.